What could be better than exploring the work of Michel Foucault through the lens of Franz Kafka's novel of 1915, The Trial? I like to think about them together, partially because of the clear affinities, but also because it helps to explain how and why we've come to represent and misrepresent Kafka's work to ourselves. If you look at the general cultural reaction to Kafka, as embodied, for instance, in the various film adaptations of his work, it seems that the Czech author's vision has been confused with something else, something like George Orwell's 1984. That cultural effect, I think, is implicitly predicted in Foucault's writing. For Foucault, the Orwellian conception of the individual's relation to the state, in which the individual is subjected by a violent and centralized power, only helps to maintain a blindness about how disciplinary power actually works. Among the various film excerpts in this video are clips from Orson Welles' 1962 adaptation of The Trial, as well as David Hugh Jones' 1993 film. There will also be excerpts from George Guidall's reading of the novel, published by Recorded Books. The Trial begins this way.
Someone must have slandered Joseph K. For one morning, without having done anything truly wrong, he was arrested. His landlady, Frau Grubach, had a cook who brought him breakfast each day around 8, but this time she didn't appear. That had never happened before. Kay waited a while longer, watching from his pillow the old woman who lived across the way, who was peering at him with a curiosity quite unusual for her. Then, both put out and hungry, he rang. There was an immediate knock at the door, and a man he'd never seen before in these lodgings entered. "Who are you?" asked Kay, and immediately sat halfway up in bed. But the man ignored the question as if his presence would have to be accepted, and merely said in turn, "You rang?" "Anna's to bring me breakfast," Kay said, scrutinizing him silently for a moment, trying to figure out who he might be. But the man didn't submit to his inspection for long, turning instead to the door and opening it a little in order to tell someone who was apparently standing just behind it, "He wants Anna to bring him breakfast."
So there we have it, the famous moment when the state first intrudes into Joseph K.'s privacy, just prior to informing him that he's under arrest for unknown reasons. But what actually happens here? For one thing, Joseph K. is not awakened by the intruder, as depicted, for instance, in Orson Welles' beautiful adaptation of the novel. We meet K. rather already awake, quote, put out and hungry, end quote, because the outer world has failed to serve him. This is the first of many indications that Joseph K. is a complacent man on the outer brink of his youth. We learn later that this day is in fact his 30th birthday, and that this novel on one level depicts the crisis of a young man who imagines himself to be outside the established civic and social structure. So on this pivotal birthday, he is forced to decide, is he or is he not going to take this structure seriously? Often overlooked in this scene of authoritarian invasion is the fact that the authorities do not enter Joseph K.'s privacy uninvited. The authorities, who are part of the machinery of K.'s trial, his life trial, as it were, have arrived at his summons.
Then, both put out and hungry, he rang. There was an immediate knock at the door, and a man he'd never seen before in these lodgings entered. "You rang?"
There are many critics, I think, who would reject the idea that K summons his trial in this way, because elsewhere in the novel it is asserted that the authorities had been sent to arrest K regardless, and that their manifestation upon K demanding his breakfast, demanding to be served by an outer world that had heretofore only mothered him, is therefore just a coincidence, a momentary illusion. But we have to remember that you can't read Kafka by the rules of ordinary realist fiction, where there is only one fixed and predetermined answer to the question of what is going on. It is an absolute cliché to say that Kafka's fiction unfolds with the logic of a dream, But it is also true. Consider, for instance, the dream you had last night, where you were riding in a train with your father to the World Fair. He was making you anxious about the trip because you hadn't secured a place to stay. Then later it turns out you're traveling with your chemistry teacher from high school, and you realize you forgot to turn in your assignment. So I would say it's not the case that your subconscious mind has made some sort of mistake when you were dreaming you were traveling with your father, a mistake that was corrected when your teacher took the place of your father in the dream. It is not the case, in other words, that the later stages of your dream reveal the real story, the real facts of the dream world, whereas the earlier stages were errors of perception. Clearly, the scenario with your father was just as important to your subconscious as the scenario with your teacher. The themes, ideas, emotions, and relationships evoked by the one scene were just as important to your dream as the other. And it may well be that the first scenario required a factual arrangement of the world, or what narrative theorists call the diegetic reality of a fictional world, that is completely different from the factual diegetic reality required by the subsequent scenario. Anyway, this is how I read Kafka's fiction. When the trial goes out of its way to stage Joseph K's arrest as something that he himself has demanded with the ring of a bell, by the way, which will be evoked later when K hears a legend that the trials of all accused men are begun with the ringing of a bell, then we have to take seriously the statement the scene is making, that K himself is an indispensable engineer of the bewildering disciplinary procedures that he will encounter. Kafka underscores this point by suggesting that the guard who has entered his room, the person who literally opens the door to these proceedings, is a double of Joseph K. himself. Partially because of the autobiographical nature of almost everything Kafka writes, scholars have long understood Joseph K.'s trials to reflect Kafka's own. So when K is ushered into his trial by a man named Franz, the signal is pretty clear. And it is comically amplified when, after the guard named Willem tells K that he shouldn't annoy them because they are, quote, probably the human beings closest to you now, end quote, Franz chimes in with, that's right, you'd better believe it, and gives K a, quote, long and no doubt meaningful look, end quote. The moment we picture this scene, in which K then, quote, allows himself to become involved in an involuntary staring match with Franz, we'd have to be pretty obtuse not to get the joke. The guards tell K that proceedings are underway and that he'll learn everything he needs to know in due time.
Of course, he could treat the whole thing as a joke, a crude joke his colleagues at the bank were playing on him for some unknown reason. Perhaps because today was his 30th birthday. That was certainly possible. Perhaps all he had to do was laugh in the guards' faces, and they would laugh with him. Nevertheless, from the moment he'd first seen the guard named Franz, he had decided firmly that this time he wouldn't let even the slightest advantage he might have over these people slip through his fingers. Kay knew there was a slight risk someone might say later that he hadn't been able to take a joke, but he clearly recalled, although he generally didn't make it a practice to learn from experience, a few occasions unimportant in themselves when, unlike his friends, he had deliberately behaved quite recklessly, without the least regard for his future, and had suffered the consequences. That wasn't going to happen again. Not this time, at any rate. If this was a farce, he was going to play along. He was still free.
This young man's 30th birthday confronts him with a pressing question. Is he going to take seriously the world of established society, which is also the real dog-eat-dog world of power and corruption, from which he has always felt aloof and independent? Or is he going to maintain his vision of it as an absurd joke, as a young man does? His decision at this point is to try to have it both ways. Quote, he was still free, end quote, and he plans to remain free and independent of this outer world by playing along, as he says, merely performing as a disciplined subject of the state, a state that the novel simply refers to as the court, although the court also represents society in general. Kay plans to hold it at a distance and hide his smirk at the farcical world. At this point in the opening scene, Kay goes on the offensive. He thrusts some papers at the guards that he hopes will show he is an authorized human being. One of those papers is, hilariously, a bicycle license, and the other is his birth certificate, the trace of that hallowed moment when his body was first inscribed into the bureaucratic machinery of the state. But the guards react exactly as many arresting officers in our world react if you insist on your right to know their names and badge numbers. On the other hand, these arresting officers, who at least show their faces, are later punished on the basis of Kay's complaints, and it's astounding to reflect that there is more accountability in this, quote, Kafkaesque arrest than we see in those conducted by ICE agents in the U.S.
"Good heavens," said the guard, "you just can't accept your situation. You seem bent on annoying us unnecessarily, although we're probably the human beings closest to you now. You're behaving worse than a child. What is it you want? We're lowly employees who can barely make our way through such documents. That's all we are. But we're smart enough to realize that before ordering such an arrest, the higher authorities who employ us inform themselves in great detail about the person they're arresting and the grounds for the arrest. There's been no mistake. After all, our department, as far as I know, and I know only the lowest level, doesn't seek out guilt among the general population, but, as the law states, is attracted by guilt, and has to send us guards out. That's the law. What mistake could there be?"
It is the perfect way to introduce the concept of the law. As we will see, the novel maps out how modern society mythologizes its own power to impose order and reason upon itself through law. We like to believe that the more or less orderly nature of society is a consequence of law. Kafka satirizes this faith by portraying the society in his novel as seeing no difference between legislated law and natural law. When the guard tells Kay that the court could not possibly be in error about his guilt because the fact of his arrest is proof of it, it is obviously on one end an indictment of totalitarian logic, but Kafka follows the consequence of this delusion to its logical end. As a priest explains to Kay later in the novel,
"You don't seem to understand the essential facts. The verdict does not come all at once. Proceedings gradually merge into the verdict."
And therefore at the moment of Kay's death at the end of the novel, his executioners, quote, drew near his face, leaning cheek to cheek, to observe the verdict. No matter what Joseph Kay's fate would have been, the inhabitants of Kafka's world will see it as the fulfillment of the law, thus granting the court a universal power that we would normally trace back only to the laws of nature, or, from another point of view, to a providential God. This idea shows up less obviously in the opening scene when Joseph Kay speaks to an inspector who has installed himself in the private room of Fräulein Bürstner, one of Kay's fellow lodgers.
"You're no doubt greatly surprised by this morning's events?" asked the inspector, arranging with both hands the few objects lying on the nightstand, a candle with matches, a book, and a pincushion, as if they were tools he required for the hearing. "Of course I'm surprised, but by no means greatly surprised." "Not greatly surprised?" asked the inspector, placing the candle in the middle of the table and grouping the other objects around it. "Perhaps you misunderstand me," Kay hastened to add. "I'm not saying I think the whole thing's a joke. The preparations involved seem far too extensive for that. All the lodgers at the boarding-house would have to be in on it, and all of you, which would go far beyond a joke, so I'm not saying it's a joke." "That's right. said the inspector, checking the number of matches in the matchbox.
The inspector arranges the objects he happens to find on the nightstand
as if they were tools he required for the hearing.
The inspector seems to imply that the random contingencies of this room have always already been foreseen by the court, and that their disposition must therefore make them appendages of the court. And when the inspector confirms the number of matches in the matchbox, as if he were checking it against some law of matchbox occupancy, Kafka is clearly confronting us with the absurd arbitrariness that can be seen in any formal procedure when perceived from the outside, as K imagines himself to be. So it is no accident that Kafka exhibits this matchbox check as part of the inspector's answer to K's question about whether he thinks these proceedings are a joke or whether they should be taken seriously. Later in his conversation with the inspector, K takes another tack.
"Haster, the public prosecutor, is a good friend of mine," he said. "Can I telephone him?" "Certainly," said the inspector. "But I don't see what sense it makes unless you have some private matter to discuss with him." "What sense?" Kay cried out, more startled than annoyed. "What sense is there in telephoning a lawyer when I've supposedly been arrested?" "Fine, I won't telephone." "But do," said the inspector, and waved toward the hall where the telephone was. "Please do telephone." "No, I no longer wish to."
Kay does want to confront and oppose, but his behavior is governed by his sense of what will or will not be intelligible within these proceedings as a confrontation. If his oppositional moves do not make sense to the court, they will not register as such. As part of his playing along with the authorities, Kay wants to achieve simultaneously agreement with them and independence from them. As he will repeatedly do so in the novel, Kay attempts to make the authorities acknowledge this condition through the gesture of a handshake.
"Now, gentlemen, in my view, it would be best to stop worrying whether or not your actions were justified and end the matter on a note of reconciliation by shaking hands."
Each time Kay offers his hand in the novel, however, it is either ignored or overlooked. As if in response to Kay's gesture, the authorities in his boarding house unexpectedly prepare to go. The inspector tells Kay he has informed him of his arrest and noted his reaction.
"That's enough for today, and we can take our leave, temporarily, of course. No doubt you wish to go to the bank now?" "To the bank?" Kay asked. "I thought I was under arrest." Kay said this with a certain insistence, for although no one had shaken his hand, he was beginning to feel increasingly independent of these people, particularly once the inspector had stood up. He was toying with them. If they did leave, he intended to follow them to the door of the building and offer to let them arrest him. And so he said again, "How can I go to the bank if I'm under arrest?" "Oh, I see," said the inspector, who was already at the door. "You've misunderstood me. You're under arrest, certainly, but that's not meant to keep you from carrying on your profession, nor are you to be hindered in the course of your ordinary life." "Then being under arrest isn't so bad," said Kay, approaching the inspector. "I never said it was."
As the scene comes to a close soon after, it's pretty clear that the trial is a world apart from the police-state dystopia depicted in fictions like George Orwell's 1984. In Orwell's vision, the state is a vast machine that represses the individual through inescapable surveillance, violence upon mind and body, and imprisonment. In the trial, however, Joseph K's movements are never compelled or restricted, except where he himself assists the authorities in doing so. In 1984, Big Brother uses propaganda and threats to pound the mind of his subjects into submission, thus altering that mind from a prior condition that was independent of the state. In Kafka, by contrast, the trial is the name of the process through which the individual consciousness is formed by the existing disciplinary procedures to which he submits himself. And the individual's sense of opposition to and independence from that process is in reality an indispensable part of his disciplinary subjection. Many viewers will have recognized that the terms I used just now to frame Kafka's novel come straight from the writing of Michel Foucault. A cornerstone of Foucault's scholarship, and one of the reasons it was so revolutionary to intellectual disciplines from history to sociology, is his argument against what he would eventually call the repressive hypothesis, which most humanistic disciplines had once taken for granted. Perhaps the clearest articulation of this argument is in the first volume of the 1976 Histoire de la Sexualité, The History of Sexuality. Foucault begins by reiterating our traditional understanding of how the concept of sexuality has evolved over time in the Western world. The traditional story is that over the course of the 19th century, the moral rigidity of European society and its increasing disgust with the human body repressed everything having to do with sexuality. It was a time when all conception of the female leg, for instance, was banished behind floor-length skirts and ankle-hugging undergarments. Foucault's research, however, tells a very different tale. What we see in the 19th century is, in fact, an unprecedented desire to explore sex, think sex, talk, study, analyze, diagnose, and fantasize sex. Never before had sex been documented to such a vast extent. Far from retreating from sexuality, this buttoned-up epic charged into it headlong. To understand the consequence of the 19th century's compulsion to articulate sex, we can look at the example of the history of homosexuality as a concept. Today, most people think that if a man is known to have had sex with another man, we have discovered some fundamental truth about his very identity. We have discovered something about his essential being. Infusing it with all the metaphysical power that a statement of identity can potentially wield, we say he is a homosexual. But what Foucault demonstrates is that, historically speaking, this is a novel idea. It was not until the 19th century, in fact, that the concept of sexuality became so elevated in Western culture that it was granted this enormous power of determining attributes of human identity. In previous eras, as Foucault says, the so-called sodomite was conceived like adulterer was, suggesting a temporary aberration. Now, the homosexual was a species. Compare the way we've come to think about acts of sex with, say, the way we think about acts of exercise. We might find out that you, for instance, have frequently used a Stairmaster machine, but we would never conclude that we have thus discovered the truth about your very being, the truth that you are a Stairmasterist. So although it is true that the eras preceding the 19th century sometimes found certain sexual behaviors remarkable or reprehensible, and sometimes not, those acts were not presumed to have revealed something fundamental about your essence or identity. This thing we call our sexuality, in other words, which we've come to think is fundamental to our identity, is in fact a concept that is produced by social and institutional discourses. The notion of sexuality was hardly repressed in the 19th century. It was elevated and hyper-articulated. So why and how did this change occur? Why did Western society become interested in assigning to the individual new attributes of identity? We can at least partially answer that question with a brief look at the core argument in Foucault's 1975 book, Surveiller et punir, translated as Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. Although the historical progression is complex, for simplicity's sake, let's say that Foucault identifies the 17th century as a turning point in how the individual was subject to power. For the vast majority of the population, the individuality of the subject in relation to the sovereign was vague and unarticulated. They were related to power only as a body within a mass of subjects. The individual body was addressed, of course, when it transgressed. Serious offenses were conceived as an assault upon the sovereign as the source of all order, and punishment for the worst of them could be elaborate, theatrical, gruesome, and could involve torture drawn out for days at a time. This spectacle of the scaffold, as Foucault calls it, was meant to demonstrate the implacable power of the sovereign over any attempt to undermine him. Over time, however, a social and political drive to reform and regulate such punishment led to an increasing bureaucratic complexity, including an expanding retinue of magistrates to carry out the sovereign's will and an increasingly complex system of rules to which they were bound. The overall effect was to distance the transgressing subject from the immediate and blunt power of the sovereign, and also from the spectacle of the scaffold. Whereas forms of interrogation, sentencing, and punishment were once an unpredictable decree of arbitrary power, the mechanisms of reform and bureaucracy required power to exert itself upon the subject in a systematic and relatively accountable way. With the increasing expectation that punishment should reform the subject, not just use his body as a deterrent spectacle, punishment would now be expected to fit not just the crime, but the individual as distinct from the mass. These reformist mechanisms transformed the subject from a mere body image to an individual interiority. The new concern with the common subject's individuality and interiority did not, however, instigate an attempt to discover some unknown reality within that subject. It is true that discipline begins with examination and surveillance, but the individual does not become a subject of power until she is submitted to already existing, already articulated tables of disciplinary knowledge, and then documented according to the attributes of those tables. Only with this act of registry is the subject created as a subject and rendered intelligible to disciplinary power. In Foucault's words, the individual was constituted as a, quote, describable, analyzable object, not in order to reduce him to specific features, as did the naturalist in relation to living beings, but in order to maintain him in his individual features under the gaze of a permanent corpus of knowledge, end quote. These techniques of producing the individual subject as an intelligible object were developed in the newly systematized penitentiary and the various correctional institutions that were its cousins. But Foucault argues that these techniques spread outward to hospitals, schools, and institutions that may or may not have been born of the state. There emerged, Foucault writes, a whole series of mechanisms that used some of the carceral methods: charitable societies, moral improvement associations, organizations that handed out assistance and also practiced surveillance, workers' estates and lodging houses, the most primitive of which still bear the all too visible marks of the penitentiary system, end quote. Kafka's novels reflect the ubiquity of modern discipline as a mechanism that permeates the very nervous system of society by making no distinction anywhere between private and public space, and by revealing that every person in Joseph K's life, including those whom he imagines to belong to a strictly separate world of his private affairs, turns out to be connected in some way to the court. In its most effectively pervasive form, then, discipline is part of the ordinary weave of life and operates without violence, struggle, or incarceration. It is, in fact, the world of Joseph K. Unlike Orwell's vision, where power exerts itself in confinement and torture, and in the threat of these, as in the old spectacle of the scaffold, in the trial there is no trace of a prison. In a disciplinary regime, one way of articulating the subject was through the institutionalization of the psyche, a process that had begun in facilities that were more carceral than hospital. Rendering the mad and the abnormal intelligible to discipline created a vast system of classification, an intricate tablature of pathology. One of the new pathologies, for instance, was homosexuality. Insofar as they articulate the subject with greater and greater granularity, such pathologies act in conjunction with the new details in the ever-expanding universe of details to which the subject is held accountable. In the way, for instance, that the soldier since the 16th century would be increasingly and rigorously accountable to more and more invented details of dress, uniform, movement, and schedule. Homosexuality was just one of an array of pathological categories created in the 19th century, including automonosexuality, mixoscopophilia, gynecomasty, presbyophilia, and sexoaesthetic inversion. Again, these are not the names of realities discovered in the psyche. They are productions of discipline. For the disciplined man, in Foucault's words, no detail is unimportant, but not so much for the meaning that it conceals within it, as for the hold it provides for the power that wishes to seize it. So, the human subject is submitted, and often submits herself, to be examined by the disciplines of the psyche. She is detailed, and then finally the tables of knowledge tell us she is a mixoscopophiliac. The once hidden truth about her has been discovered. This truth is then registered, and this process is what Foucault calls a ritual of truth, a technique by which production of truth is disguised as discovery. As Foucault puts it, quote, "We must cease once and for all to describe the effects of power in negative terms. It excludes, it represses, it censors, it abstracts, it masks, it conceals. In fact, power produces. It produces domains of objects and rituals of truth. The individual and the knowledge that may be gained of him belong to this production." End quote. Discipline achieves its most effective disguise, however, where the individual renders himself as a disciplined subject. Through the questionnaire, the affidavit, the self-diagnosis, the profile, the online quiz, the interview, application, or testimonial, a disciplinary society cannot function without the individual articulating himself as a subject of power and in its terms of intelligibility. These apparatus are what Foucault calls incitements to discourse. Like the man from the country in the famous parable of the law recounted by a chaplain in the trial, Joseph K. drives himself towards authority and its recognition.
Kay waited from day to day throughout the following week for further notification. He couldn't believe they had taken his waiver of interrogations literally, and when the expected notification had not arrived by Saturday evening, he took it as an implicit summons to appear again in the same building at the same time.
So Kay's freedom of movement is not restricted, and yet that free-willed movement brings him deeper and deeper into the trial. The same is true of his freedom of speech. There is no suppression of thought or expression in the world of the trial. Kay has no difficulty in voicing his protest. He can even rail against the authorities to their faces and in the most public manner possible. And yet this freedom of conscience and expression follows a disciplinary desire, as expressed by what Joseph K. thinks of as his strategy in the opening confrontation. He wanted to, quote, slip into his guard's thoughts somehow and turn them to his own advantage, or accustom himself to them. I'd like to let Foucault's own words articulate more precisely here the evolution of documentary individuation in relation to power. For a long time, Foucault writes, ordinary individuality, the everyday individuality of everybody, remained below the threshold of description. To be looked at, observed, described in detail, followed from day to day by an uninterrupted writing, was a privilege. The chronicle of a privileged man, the account of his life, his historiography, written as he lived out his life, formed part of the rituals of his power. The more one possesses power or privilege, the more one is marked as an individual by rituals, written accounts, or visual reproductions. The name and the genealogy that situate one within a kinship group, the performance of deeds that demonstrate superior strength and which are immortalized in literary accounts, the monuments or donations that bring survival after death, all these are procedures of an ascending individualization. In a disciplinary regime, on the other hand, individualization is descending. As power becomes more anonymous and more functional, those on whom it is exercised tend to be more strongly individualized. It is exercised by comparative measures that have the norm as reference, rather than genealogies giving ancestors as points of reference." End quote. The norm is the new reference point, and yet the thing that makes the individual intelligible to discipline is, in large part, the collected attributes of his delinquency and pathology. We see the consequence today, for instance, in a study of the British Journal of Psychiatry, which claims that only 23% of the British population has no personality pathology. As Foucault writes, quote, "When one wishes to individualize the healthy, normal, and law-abiding adult, it is always by asking how much of the child he has in him, what secret madness lies within him, what fundamental crime he has dreamt of committing." End quote. So with the development of descending individuation, disciplinary methods, quote, "lowered the threshold of describable individuality and made of this description a means of control and a method of domination." And this new describability is all the more marked in that the disciplinary framework is a strict one. The child, the patient, the madman, the prisoner were to become, with increasing ease from the 18th century, the object of individual descriptions and biographical accounts. End quote. Biographical accounts, but also autobiographical ones as well. As an effect of the disciplinary society's incitement to discourse, Joseph K. comes to feel that the only hope for his trial is to write a full and complete account of himself for the powers that be, what the novel calls his petition. All will be well, he thinks, when he has rendered himself inside and out into the registries of discipline, where he will finally be fully intelligible to power.
Admittedly, the petition meant an almost endless task. One needn't be particularly faint of heart to be easily persuaded of the impossibility of ever finishing the petition, because without knowing the nature of the charge and all its possible ramifications, his entire life, down to the smallest actions and events, would have to be called to mind, described, and examined from all sides.
As Foucault says, quote, "This turning of real lives into writing is no longer a procedure of heroization. It functions as a procedure of objectification and subjection. This written individuality is no longer a monument for future memory, but a document for possible use. These documentary techniques make each individual a case which at one and the same time constitutes an object for a branch of knowledge and a hold for a branch of power." End quote. So, whereas at the beginning of his trial, Kay had imagined that he was merely performing as a disciplined subject, he would play along with the trial, it turns out that those performative acts are precisely how the individual becomes subjected. One might object that the concept of performance here suggests the individual retains a psychic reserve independent of discipline. But look at Joseph K. He thinks he is merely performing discipline, but he believes simultaneously that the only way out of the world of discipline is to explain himself more thoroughly, to inscribe himself ever more diligently into the tables and registries of power. Our collective and unconscious devotion to discipline is evident, I think, in how we have explained the work of Franz Kafka to ourselves. The interpretations of Kafka that exist on film, for instance, show that we would much rather believe him to be saying that the individual is free of discipline until she is threatened with violence, coercion, and imprisonment. Thus, in the most acclaimed adaptation of the trial, directed by Orson Welles in 1963, Welles feels compelled to insert into Kafka's vision precisely the repressive hypothesis that the novel clearly rejects. As the guards search through Joseph K's lodgings in the film, Welles has K announcing, quote, "I'm sorry to disappoint you, but you won't find any subversive literature or pornography." Welles's thesis is clear. The state is coming down on Joseph K to repress a desire within him that is otherwise free of discipline. Given the history of individuation that Foucault exhibits, it is predictable that Welles chooses to represent this repressed desire as sexual desire.
I can remember my father looking at me, straight in the eye. "Come on, boy," he'd say. "Exactly what have you been up to?" And even when I hadn't been up to anything at all, I'd still feel guilty. You know that feeling? And the teacher at school making the announcement that something was missing from her desk. "All right, who's the guilty one?" It was me, of course. I'd feel just sick with guilt. And I didn't even know it was missing. Maybe, that must be it. Unless your thoughts are innocent. 100%. Can that be said of anybody? Even the saints have temptations.
The worst offender, however, in erasing Kafka's vision of a disciplinary society and replacing it with Orwell's totalitarianism is surely Steven Soderbergh's ridiculous film Kafka, released in 1992. Soderbergh depicts a world of kidnapping, torture, and imprisonment, a regime of, quote, body snatching, as the protagonist puts it. The film loudly reiterates one of the most common and glaring misinterpretations of Kafka's work by portraying it in every frame as a paranoid vision. It is rare, in fact, to find commentary on the trial that does not rely on the concept of paranoia. Soderbergh obliges this misreading by positing in his film a hidden, removed, and coordinated totalitarian power, easily embodied in the figure of a single despotic mastermind. In the trial, however, the paranoid vision is the mythology that the novel explodes. One of the reasons that most adaptations fail to capture both the nightmare and the comedy of Kafka's work is that they do not want to acknowledge that K's trial is an organism without center. There is no man behind the curtain. The inaccessible high judges about whom Kay hears so much in the novel are mere legends. There is no coherent, singular, and accountable center of power that is keeping its eye on Joseph K. It seems that our collective imagination wants to replace Kafka's depiction of permeating discipline with a comforting depiction of monstrous Orwellian totalitarianism. Comforting because we can always say with relief that we're not there yet.